Hi everybody. Today you guys are going to be looking at the perspectives and how each of the 6 perspectives would explain why mental illness occurs or why somebody might have depression or OCD or phobias. So if you could, with your table groups, could you make sure you guys get out the worksheet that you were supposed to have completed for yesterday that has the perspectives along the left side and then how each perspective explains human personality and then your guesstimation as to how they might explain then mental illness. If you can grab that, that would be wonderful. The first perspective I'm going to have you discuss in your groups is the psychoanalytic perspective. So please discuss in your group both the columns of how it explains human personality as well as what your guess is to how it explains why mental illness occurs. So please, if you could pause this, do that, and then press play again before you go to the next perspective. That would be wonderful. Thanks. Okay, hopefully you had paused it and coming back looking at the psychoanalytic perspective. First of all, going way back to when we looked at the behavior of Ferris Bueller from the psychoanalytic perspective, we looked at the fact that his personality was shaped somehow from experiences that he had in childhood. Those experiences that he had were repressed, but yet those experiences still affect the individual as they grow older into their teenage and adult years. Similarly, if we look from how it explained why somebody might have depression or any other mental illness, they would talk about the fact that these repressed childhood memories are extremely negative, and this is still negatively affecting us today. So not just that it's might be a part of who we are and affecting us to a lesser degree, it is very much so negatively affecting us today. We're not necessarily consciously aware as to why we might be experiencing those feelings of depression or why we might be experiencing those OCD tendencies, but somehow we have a feeling, and that's what causes us to experience those emotions. So given that understanding that childhood events caused it and were repressed, somehow as we think forward to the therapeutic technique from the psychoanalytic perspective is somehow they're going to want to try and uncover those negative repressed childhood experiences in order to allow us the opportunity to deal with those issues in order to better move forward and not suffer with, fill in the blank of the mental illness that individual might be suffering with. If you could now again pause it and discuss the humanistic perspective, that would be great. Looking at the humanistic perspective, our personality from the humanistic perspective is a result of what we might be missing on that hierarchy of needs. As you recall, the hierarchy of needs has those 5 steps from food and shelter, self-esteem, love and belongingness, self-actualization. An individual personality is a resulting of how successful or unsuccessful we are on those hierarchy and those needs, meeting those needs, as well as they look at how close we are to becoming what Carl Rogers called a fully functioning individual, where that how close and overlapping is our ideal self to our real self, and the closer those two things match, the more likely we are a fully functioning individual. And the overarching belief of the humanistic perspective, as you remember, is that we are born good individuals and that it's things or people or experiences in our society that really have the negative or positive effects on who we become. So looking at somebody who might suffer from mental illness might be a result of missing numerous items on that hierarchy of needs. Perhaps that individual has more of those needs not being met than being met. And additionally, there might be a strong discrepancy between the ideal and the real self, in which neither of those things are overlapping one another, which is causing a lot of stress and anxiety, and in turn causing that mental illness. If you can try and think forward to looking at the therapy, which is what the next unit that we're going to go into, if this is the belief behind the humanistic perspective as to why we have mental illness, what might be the goal of somebody from the humanistic perspective? What might they want to do if they take on the humanistic perspective in therapy? What might be their goals as a therapist, given this is their belief as to why you suffer with mental illness? So you can talk about that with your table partners or your small groups if you'd like, as well as if you can pause it and talk about the behavioral perspective, that would be great. All right, looking at the behavioral perspective. Behavioral perspective is also called learning, might be the perspective that it's called. And from the behavioral perspective, normal behavior or human personality is learned, just like any other behavior. So it's learned through operant conditioning, so using positive or negative reinforcement or positive or negative punishment, using classical conditioning, and or through the use of observational learning. If we look in contrast to that to the how it explains mental illness, it's very similar. They think that you learn your personality traits just as much as you learn some of those traits or criteria of mental illness. So an individual has learned through operant or classical conditioning or observational learning some of those traits and characteristics that become evident in mental illness. So an individual might have a parent who has a phobia or fear of something, and they in turn, through observation, have learned to have that same phobia that their parent may have. They might look at the coping mechanisms of an adult in their life, it's kind of negative coping mechanisms, and they might take on those same negative coping mechanism strategies as well as a result. Perhaps even an individual becomes classically conditioned to experience anxiety to a known origin or no known origin. But just as much as our regular personality traits are learned, mental illness is also something that's learned through environmental responses that occur. Again, you want to think about, in foreshadowing for our next unit, how might somebody who takes on a behavioral form of psychotherapy, what might be their goal of treatment if they believe that we've learned through operant, classical, and observational learning, we've learned these mental illnesses. What might be their goal then of therapy? So again, talk about that idea with your table groups, as well as if you could discuss the cognitive perspective, that would be great. All right, looking at the cognitive perspective. The cognitive perspective says that our human personality is a result of our thoughts and interpretations of life events. So how we think about something affects how we act. And so our positive thinking or our negative thinking impacts our behavior and how we portray ourselves to others. Additionally, mental illness results from kind of those negative internal sentences we say to ourselves, or the thoughts that negatively affect our behavior. So if we interpret things in life in a negative perception, or if we think negatively, or if we don't have a lot of self-confidence in our internal sentences, those are the types of things that cause the mental illness. Again, thinking from a therapeutic perspective, if they believe that these negative internal sentences or these thoughts that we have cause or has an outcome of that being causing mental illness, what might be the goal of somebody from the cognitive perspective? If you could also, when you talk about that, talk about the sociocultural perspective, that would be great. All right, the sociocultural perspective says that we are kind of who we hang out with. We are a part of our environment. So our school environment, our family environment, our friends, our club, our sports, whoever we choose to surround ourselves with, we become a part of what types of traits and characteristics those individuals have. So looking from mental illness is a result of kind of a negative social environment that negatively impacts the individual. So perhaps they don't have a very supportive society or culture or family, and that lack of support in that family might lead to mental illness, or that individual surrounds themselves with other people who have phobias as well, and because of that society that they're a part of, they in turn take on some of those same traits and characteristics that an individual in that society has. And so you kind of are who you hang out with from this perspective. Sociocultural perspective really doesn't become a form of psychotherapy, so thinking about how they might treat somebody is not really very helpful for this portion of the unit. But if you could talk about the last perspective, which is biological or biophysiological or neuroscience, that would be wonderful. All right, the final perspective, biological, biophysiological, or neuroscience, believes that our personality is a result of our chemical makeup, the structures and functions of our brain and our nervous system. It essentially looks at the biology to explain the psychology. So it looks at internal functionings of our body to help us understand what makes the human personality the way it is. And so if we look at why somebody has mental illness perhaps as a result of some sort of imbalance of chemicals in their brain, similar to if you went back to chapter 2 when we talked about the function of some neurotransmitters like serotonin's connection to mood, and how perhaps an unbalanced amount of serotonin in our body not only affects our mood, but could also be an explanation as to why somebody has depression. Or we also had talked about during our Unit 2 about the dopamine hypothesis and how an excess of dopamine has been linked to individuals who suffer from schizophrenia. So you have an imbalance of those chemicals, either too much of one or not enough, and because of that imbalance, it's causing those symptoms of particular mental illness, such as serotonin and depression, or dopamine and schizophrenia. Additionally, it might be damage that we have to a portion of our brain that as well could be causing those negative outcomes. But the same as explaining human personality, it looks at that biology to explain and understand the psychology behind it. So those are the 6 perspectives and how they would explain mental illness. Again, I hope we're thinking ahead, even with this perspective as well, as, okay, we have this understanding as to why somebody from this perspective believes another individual suffers from mental illness. Now, if I put the cap on of treatment, if I believe this is why you have this disorder, what might be my goal in therapy in order to help you get through the struggles that you're facing at this current moment? Additionally, if you have some time, you want to start thinking about looking at that study guide and preparing for our exam that is on Tuesday. You want to make sure that you are not memorizing or writing down every single diagnostic criteria for all of those disorders, but rather understanding what makes those disorders unique or what makes those disorders different from each other. For example, I had mentioned that, when we look at panic disorder versus phobia, well, both of them have either panic attacks or panic attack-like symptoms. Well, how would you tell the difference between an example of somebody who has panic disorder or somebody who has a phobia? Well, if we remember, one of the distinctions is that in panic disorder, the individual has reoccurring panic attacks, but they're of no known origin. So that individual doesn't know what causes or what sparks that. Versus somebody with a phobia may have those panic attacks or those panic-like symptoms, but they have a known origin. They know that it's from whatever it is they have a fear or a phobia of. So you want to make sure that you're identifying in all those disorders what are the distinct diagnostic criteria that make that disorder unique or different. Another example might be when you look at like dissociative identity disorder. Yes, it has 2 altering personality states, but additionally, you're going to have that patient who also has some memory loss. Those are pretty distinct diagnostic criteria that make that disorder unique from another disorder. So please make sure that you are looking through that. Also that you are completing your note cards for Tuesday, because some of those disorders were not covered in our True Life presentation, but will be assessed on that unit exam. So make sure you are comfortable with anorexia, bulimia, binge eating disorders, somatoform, and conversion disorders, especially, so that you are set to go. As always, send me an email, stop by and see me on Monday if you have any questions, and I would be happy to try and explain things further to you through email or in person. So I hope you have a wonderful day and that you are kind and wonderful to our sub today, who's so wonderful for being here for us, and use the rest of the class time wisely to work on that study guide. I hope you have a great weekend. Again, shoot me an email if you have any questions. Have a great weekend.